Hello and welcome to this PIR live event brought to you by Partners in Research Canada. My name is Stacey Joyce and I will be your host. If you're joining us live, please remember to navigate to the top left corner of your screen there, click chat, and you can send us questions in any time. You can send those in during the presentation and we'll queue them up for later. Make sure when you send that along that in the to field of your chat, you select all panelists and attendees, and that way our audience can see what other audience members are asking along the way. Also, please include your name or your school or city so we can give you a shout out when we ask your question. So today's guest is Dr. Chris Eliasmith. He is the Canada Research Chair in Theoretical Neuroscience, the Director of the Centre for Theoretical Neuroscience. He is a professor jointly appointed in Philosophy and Systems Design Engineering, cross-appointed to Computer Science, and all of this is at the University of Waterloo. Thank you so much for joining us, Chris. I'll let you take it away.
Oh, thank you very much for the introduction. It's good to have everybody online. This will be a unique experience since I've never done a webinar before. But I'll begin, I guess, by sharing my screen and just introducing you to the area of research that I focus on. So is everybody able to see that okay? Great. So I think the easiest way to understand what I'm interested in is coming to grips with how we work. That is, how our brain functions to make us do all the stuff we do. And usually it doesn't take too much explanation to get people interested in this area of research, which is kind of cool because everybody has a brain and nobody knows how it works. So we've got lots of questions. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is about the kind of approaches that my lab takes in trying to answer these questions. How do brains work? So this is my sort of Harry Potter version of a book that I published recently, which literally has the title, How to Build a Brain. And when I presented this book idea originally to the publisher, they thought, maybe it was a little too much to suppose that anybody knew how to build a brain at all. But I think there's a, common misconception that we have really no understanding about how brains work. You even find famous neuroscientists beginning papers all the time in which they say, well, we really don't know how the brain works, but I'm going to tell you about one very specific tiny little part of the brain that I study. And I think that does a disservice to really what we've learned over the last 10 years, especially about how neurons communicate with one another, how they're organized, what kinds of representations they use, and how we can actually try to begin to replicate a lot of the functions or the kinds of behaviors that you actually get out of brains. And so, I sort of insisted to my publisher that I really wanted to title the book this, and luckily they let me do that. And what I'm going to do today is sort of tell you what the biggest brain model that anyone's built to date is and what it looks like and the kinds of things that it can do. And then I'll open it up to questions, which hopefully you'll have lots, and we can maybe dig into some of the details in a little bit more depth. So chapter 7 of that book, we introduce a model that's called Spaun. So this stands for Semantic Pointer Architecture Unified Network, which doesn't really matter, but we call it Spaun for short. And one thing to keep in mind about this model is that it's what we call a mechanistic model. That means that, like a mechanism on your bicycle, so you have a bicycle with gears and wheels and chains between them, you really want to know how these things push and pull each other around in order to make that bicycle work. So that's a mechanism. Inside the brain, of course, we don't have gears and so on, but we have instead our neurons. And these neurons talk to each other. They send signals of various kinds using little bits of electricity and chemistry. They can tell each other when they think something important's happened or when something important hasn't happened and so on. And so we really want to build a model which kind of works in that way, where we have neurons in the model and they talk in the same kind of way that real neurons do. And then run the model and see if we can get some of the things coming out of the model that we actually see in real brains. And I guess I should also mention that when I say model, what I mean is essentially a computer program. So we have computers where we tell the computer how to simulate one neuron, and then we figure out how to take millions of those simulations, link them all together. So, each neuron in our simulation is supposed to be like one neuron in the real brain. We link them together in the ways that they're linked together in the real brain. And then when we hit play on our software, we think that the kind of behavior that's being generated by the model, we can compare directly to the kind of behavior we can record or look at from real brains. So this Spaun model that I mentioned, we built it quite a while ago now. It's almost 5 years. And it came out in this journal called Science and was covered all over the world by the popular press. And I did lots of interviews and so on, which was kind of fun. And the reason was because it was basically the largest, and actually remains the largest brain model that anyone's built, which actually does stuff. So, it actually performs behaviors that we can compare to what animals do. So it has 2.5 million neurons, and it does 8 different tasks. So, just like your brain can do lots of different things, we want this model to also do lots of different things. And so here's some examples. So hopefully you can see this video running okay. And if I just ask you what this is doing, what is this brain doing? So you can see a brain there, and there's some sort of neural activity being colored red and blue, and it's got an arm, and you can see the muscles in the arm, and when the muscles change their tension, they also turn colors. You can see it has an eye, the eye's staring at a screen. The screen is showing some stuff, right? So it's showing some numbers and question marks. And hopefully by now you'll notice that whenever we show it a number, and we show it a question mark, the 4 question mark, and it writes down a 4. Which means it recognized that as actually being a 4, and it can tell you what it saw. So of course we can do exactly the same kind of task on people. I could sit you down and have you recognize those numbers. These are just handwritten digits. So, handwriting from people. And you would do a pretty good job, and you'll notice that Spaun is also doing a pretty good job. It gets about 98% of them correct, and people get also about 98% of them correct. The nice thing about this model, though, is that we can actually look inside of it. So now I'm showing some thought bubbles in the back there. We can see all the neurons, that stuff sort of streaming through the back of the thought bubble is the neural activity, which is all these very brief pulses coming from thousands of different neurons in the visual system. And we can basically read those pulses and see what we think the eye actually was shown. To do this task, we also have to remember what we saw in order to write it down. So here's a memory thought bubble. So you can see that 0 sort of sticks around for a while before it draws it. And then lastly, there's a part of the brain which is like the motor system. So that's what actually tells the arm how to move in order to trace out the path, which is what we see afterwards as handwriting. So it's kind of nice to be able to build these models where you can give the same input to the model that you give to humans. Like I said, I could sit you down and show you the same sort of thing so we can compare the behavior directly, but then we have this benefit where we can just dig right into the model and see what individual neurons are doing. Now that's actually a pretty simple task. So we're also interested in cognitive tasks. So cognitive tasks are ones which are generally harder, and this particular cognitive task is something that only people can do very well. And in fact, it's used as an intelligence test. So the better you do on this kind of problem, the more intelligent people would say you are. So here's an example of this problem. So if you look at that, and I tell you what you need to do is fill in that last square where there's a question mark. Hopefully you're looking at it, and maybe it's obvious by now. It goes in there. And the reason that only people can do this is sort of interesting. Basically, it's because what you figure out goes at the end is just a function of how many other things are in the box before. It doesn't really matter what the digit is. What matters is that there's 1 of that digit, then 2 of that digit, and then 3 of that digit. And that's a very sort of abstract kind of reasoning where you ignore the perceptual properties. So you ignore that it's a 1, a 4, or 5, and you just notice, oh, there's this structure that there's 1 thing, 2 things, and 3 things. So now we can see Spaun doing the same thing. It can't move its eyes, right? So we can't actually show it that. So instead we're showing it each of the little boxes in that matrix one at a time. But it's never seen this before, just like you hadn't seen it before when I showed you. And it's trying to figure out what is the pattern here. So that when we show it the question mark at the end, it's actually going to write out its answer, which is hopefully the same as yours. And so it writes out 3 5s. And of course we can figure out, did it really guess the answer? Or is it just kind of doing something that people wouldn't do? Probably what you think the answer is that you have to increase it by 1. Like however many 5s you saw, you have to increase it by 1. So we could actually ask Spaun, what would come after the box that you just filled in, and it will write 4 5s, even though it's never seen 4 5s. So it's really figured out, kind of like you did, that there's a sort of +1 item pattern to those boxes. All right, so this is sort of like a high-level cognitive example, and before I showed you a really simple perceptual example, And maybe the most important thing, as I sort of mentioned, is that exactly the same model can do all kinds of different stuff. So I'm not going to show you all of them, but right now I haven't actually showed you how it can do more than one. I've just shown you one task at a time. So whenever Spaun does more than one task, we show it the letter A. So we'll see it coming up here in a sec. Here's the letter A. There it is. And then after a digit, 1. So right now, A1 means to Spaun recognize these digits, just like we saw it doing before. So we say A1, Spaun's like, oh, I need to recognize whatever I see next. So then we show it a digit, a 2, and a question mark, and it writes it out. And we can have different kinds of tasks. So we can show it A0, which is coming up now. And now we're going to show it a digit and a question mark, but it's supposed to copy the style of the digit. So it saw a 2 with a loopy bottom, so it drew a 2 with a loopy bottom. So if we do exactly the same task where we want to copy the style, we showed a different style of 2 with a straight bottom, you can see that it does that same kind of thing. This is another task. Here it's actually learning. So we're just showing it, we're basically saying, guess what number is in my head, and it's guessing a 1, a 2, or a 0, 1, or a 2. And right now it's guessing 1, but we're showing it a 0, meaning, no, that's not right. And so it guesses other numbers, which are also wrong. And eventually it will guess the right number, which is a 2, and we'll begin to give it a 1, which means it got a point for guessing that number. And we can change which number it has to guess, and it can sort of figure out on the fly what the right number is as we go through that test. This is actually, I think I'm going to skip this one. This is another, like a sort of that intelligence test one we saw before, where it's figuring out a kind of complicated cognitive pattern. Yeah, I won't explain it, but we'll just look at the very last one here. So this is remembering a list of digits. And this is like you might have to remember your locker number or telephone number or something. And what's interesting in this one is if you watch Spaun's memory at the top there, where it's showing the digits, some of the digits are fading away, the 8 and the 7. So when Spaun writes out its answer, when it gets to that 8, it actually draws a straight line, meaning it doesn't really know what goes there, but then it keeps completing the list. And what's important about that is it made a mistake. Right? And when we're building these brain models, we don't want it to just do perfectly. We actually want it to fail in the way that people fail. And so there we saw an example of it, forgetting the number in the middle. And if you do the same test on people, you find that people generally remember the beginning of a list or the end of a list better than the middle of a list. And we can show that Spaun is exactly that same kind of thing. So at the very end, I'm just going to throw up a couple of slides of data, which I don't really want to explain in detail, but just to give you a sense of how we can use this kind of model. So just ignore, this is a little bit more about the structure of Spaun, but let's look at some data. So here's a task where we've got a bunch of dots, and what those dots are is basically activities from different neurons. And in the top row of dots, which is kind of gray, that's actually information that was recorded from a rat's brain. And so this rat is performing a task just like the one we saw when Spaun was performing, it was kind of guess what number we had in mind. And on the bottom, you can see black dots. Those are dots that come out of the Spaun model. And what we can do is sort of see, just by eye, that those are actually really quite similar. And so this makes us think that we actually have some of the mechanisms right. So we're making the neurons talk to each other in the right kind of way to solve this task, because when we have real brains do it, we get very similar patterns of neural activity. So that's interesting because we can begin to compare what we see to all the details that we can get out of animals, but we can't do these kinds of experiments on humans. But nevertheless, we can also compare high-level behavioral data. So this is on the left human data, where people are remembering lists of digits, and on the right we have the model data. And it's a little bit complicated to interpret, but we can confidently say that the model is statistically identical to the humans that were tested during that same task of trying to remember lists of digits. So this means we can look at the behavior of Spaun as well and actually compare it directly to how people work. So I think that gives you a sort of overall idea what the work in my lab is focused on. I want to mention that this is obviously not something you do on your own. So here are a lot of the people who are in my lab over the last couple of years. And many of them have built parts of the model or helped put the model together and test it in different ways and extend it in all kinds of ways that I haven't talked about. But at this point, I think hopefully that gives you enough background to generate some questions, and I'd be happy to take any questions if people have them.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Eliasmith. If you can go ahead and click the stop share button, we'll be able to see you a little more clearly as you answer questions. Awesome. The first question I have for you is with this very large team that worked on Spaun with you and other projects, how long did it take you to build this model?
Right, that's a good question. It depends how you look at it, I suppose. So I've been working on understanding neural computation for a long time, ever since I was a grad student. So about 20 years now. But of course, I wasn't working on the Spaun model at that time. If you want to just talk about how long from the time Spaun was thought of as an idea to when it was actually built, it was actually only 6 months. So, I was writing my book and I thought people won't really pay attention or believe these ideas are very useful unless I show how you can actually build a large model with them. So I sort of designed the model and then asked students to contribute work they had already done. So I built, I sort of designed a model that I knew could use a lot of the work we had already done in the lab. And I gave that as a project to one student. He put it together in about 6 months. The real answer is probably somewhere between there, right? Because a lot of, like the working memory, for instance, was something that somebody had worked on for their master's thesis. So that was 2 years of work going into that part of the model. The visual system, similarly, the motor system, the same kind of thing. And so, many people had spent a lot of time making all of the components. And so it was actually fairly quick to put them all together. But in actual fact, probably should count all the time that it took for people to build the components as well as putting them together.
So did you have multiple iterations or versions along the way, or did it all kind of just come together pretty close to what you have now?
So the model that I just showed you is about 5 years old, and that came together in 6 months, like I said. So that was really what we had 6 months ago that we were able to publish. There were no iterations of that version of the model. Of course, we've been doing more than twiddling our thumbs for the last 5 years, so we've been iterating on that. And now we have a model which does actually a lot more things than what that model does. It has a way better visual system, so that model can recognize handwritten digits, so 10 different numbers. And now the model can recognize thousands of categories, all kinds of different cats and trees and scenes and all kinds of things. So it can see a lot better. Its motor system is much more sophisticated. It can adapt to unknown forces and basically just be a better motor system. Its handwriting is much neater. So these kinds of things have improved, and we continue to do that. A lot of what we do in the lab is people focusing on one particular function of the brain, and then once we feel we have a handle on that, seeing if we can integrate it into Spaun to make sure that it's really compatible with all the other elements that we have going on in the model.
Very interesting. So one thing we have not touched on yet is, what does philosophy have to do with your research?
Philosophy has everything to do with my research. So my PhD is in philosophy, actually. And for most areas of science, when it gets theoretical enough, you are essentially asking the same questions that philosophers have asked. So in the case of neuroscience, when it gets theoretical enough, we're asking questions about, what are the representations inside our head? This is a question that was asked thousands of years ago by the Greek philosophers who were trying to figure out how, whatever was going on inside our body, they didn't even know our brain was actually the thing to focus on, but was it whatever was going on inside our soul for them, how that related to these things that they saw in the world. So you could see a dog in the world, but obviously the dog wasn't in your head. There was something else in your head. And you could manipulate the thing in your head. You could imagine it bigger and smaller, and you could rotate it around and all kinds of things. So the question is, what is that thing in your head? And philosophers have been asking that question for thousands of years, and right now we're asking it in a more mathematical context, perhaps. But we're still asking those same kinds of questions, and a lot of the considerations that philosophers have brought to bear on that question still remain when we're trying to think about how all the neurons act together in order to represent a dog inside our head.
So do you find that you are working to answer the same questions that exist in the field of philosophy? Or do you find that you use things that have been learned in the area of philosophy and applying them to sort of systems design engineering and computer science? Is it a two-way street, or are you both just sort of headed to the same destination?
I think I would say it's a two-way street. So philosophy is a funny field where once you know something for sure, it's kind of not philosophy anymore. So, a lot of the things that we feel we understand become more like neuroscience or computer science or something. And philosophy is the place where you get lots of interesting questions and you get ways of thinking about, what could representations even be? How can representations be wrong? So these general questions for which there's really no consensus. And so, my work has been taking some of those questions and trying to answer them in a rigorous sort of way. So with a lot of mathematics and so on, and computer simulations to back up the mathematics, and show that, here is a theory about what representations are, how they carry information about the world and so on, and expressing those philosophical theories mathematically, which can change the philosophical theory, which is interesting to go back and explain to the philosophers. But it's also the case that the theory that's generated sort of on the more computational side or mathematical side is highly informed by the kind of philosophical theories that have been around or that I'm partial to or what have you. So I really do think that both philosophy and computer science mathematics are contributing to the work.
Awesome. So I think the next question I should ask you here is how this compares to some other artificial intelligence that our students watching today might be familiar with, like Watson, who competed on Jeopardy, or maybe others. How does Spaun compare and the other things you're doing?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two main differences that we might want to focus on. So, AI is changing so quickly that pretty much everything I'm going to say is a bit of a generalization. But if you look at something like Watson, for instance, that is really functioning in a way that is not like the brain. And we pretty much know that we don't have, 15,000 different algorithms, all of which are trying to generate an answer to a question that's written in text. And then picking which the best answer is based on some statistical model. It doesn't seem like, so that's how Watson works. It doesn't seem like how the brain works. There are other, ways in which questions are generated. There's other ways in which our memory is searched. And so when we build a model like Spaun, we're really trying to replicate the biological algorithms. And we care a lot about making sure that when we replicate those algorithms, we can make predictions about human behavior and make the same kinds of errors as humans make and so on. Watson, of course, is not interested in that. They want to eliminate as many errors as possible. They don't care if the way that their model works is the way the brain works or not. It's really just about solving that function, that really specific function, right? Namely, answering questions on Jeopardy. And there's a lot of aspects of Watson which are very tailored to Jeopardy in particular, of the one that won the game. They've sort of, tried to generalize it to other fields, but generally once you have Watson in a field, you do a lot of work to tailor it to that field. What's special about the human brain, and then what I just said there is also true of things like AI chess playing machines or, AlphaGo, which came out of Google. It's a big neural network, so it's a little bit more like a brain in some ways, but it's very tailored to playing playing Go. You'll notice that one of the things we want to do with Spaun is make it be able to do lots of things. So human brains, I'm sure people can, like people sitting in these classrooms right now, some of them probably play hockey or soccer or other sports. They can go from doing that to sitting in a classroom and doing a math problem, turning around, playing a video game, having a conversation with somebody, writing an email. They probably can't drive a car, but when they're old enough, they'll be able to drive cars. And so, it's exactly the same brain essentially, which is doing all of those things. Brain doesn't change super fast between, not nearly as fast as we can switch tasks. And this is something that we wanted to understand with Spaun. So how can we build a brain which, it can learn, but it doesn't learn fast enough to have to learn something completely new every time a new task shows up. And so, yeah, being able to do lots of different tasks, be a sort of a general problem solver, is something that we're a little more focused on with this neural model than what AI tends to be. AI tends to be very application specific, right? Drive a car, play Go, play chess and what have you. And when it comes to the general problems, that's when they tend to fall down.
Great. Well, I have a question now that's coming from Mississauga, Ontario, and Ms. Bertovich's her class there, sorry. How does the Spaun model relate to convolutional neural networks?
Good question. So I should probably explain what convolutional neural networks are.
Yes, I believe the school neuroscience club there is sending in this question, but our other viewers may not be quite as advanced in the field.
Right, so convolutional neural networks are very famous right now, and actually probably everybody in the classroom has used one, although they haven't known it. So essentially, if you've ever used a Macintosh or a Google application where the computer goes through and recognizes faces, it's probably using a convolutional neural network to do that. Or Facebook. Facebook also does this. So essentially what these networks are for is classifying images. So you give it a static image, and then it can tell you that what's in that image is a dog, or it can tell you that it's a particular person's face, or it can tell you that it's a scene of whatever, a forest or what have you. And right now we've actually been able to build convolutional neural networks which are as good as people at those kinds of tasks. So they're as good as people at classifying faces, they're as good as people as recognizing objects and images. And convolutional neural networks are interesting because they're neural networks, and because they're neural networks, they're actually kind of like the brain. And even more detailed, convolution is an idea that came from neuroscience. So people began to build, AI researchers are like, we want something that's going to classify images really well. How does the brain do it? And they noticed that in the early layers of the visual cortex, you see something that looks like this convolution going on. And so they replicated that in their neural networks. And then they trained the networks in order to do classification, and they are beating everybody else. So that's an interesting case of where AI has actually learned something from looking at the brain. Now, how the Spaun model relates to that is that essentially the visual system in Spaun is a convolutional neural network. So, we realized, as many people have, that convolutional neural networks are actually very similar to the brain because they were sort of designed to be that way. And so when we thought of building a visual system, we went and borrowed ideas from convolutional neural networks, with a bit of a twist to make sure that they were actually using the kind of communication that real neurons use. So they use spikes, which convolutional neural networks don't. They work over time, which convolutional neural networks don't. So we made a couple of variations to that style of network and put it in our brain model. And really it plays the role of doing the early visual processing in the model. Now, of course, Spaun goes way beyond that. So if you look at the most recent version of Spaun, it now has about 4.5 million neurons. Only about 750,000 of those are in the visual system. So, about less than a quarter, or about a quarter, I guess, are in the visual system. And everything else in Spaun is not a convolutional neural network. So, it definitely takes that technology and leverages it to relate it to how brains function, because it is related. But then it does a bunch of other stuff to, then go on and move an arm around, which convolutional neural networks can't do, to try to reason in that cognitive task that I showed, which also those networks can't do, and so on.
So I'm going to do my best here to squeeze in a couple more questions before we wrap it up. The first one is, what types of other experts do you find yourself collaborating with? This seems like a really big team of people coming together with complementary expertise. So what are the roles of those people in the team?
Right, that's a good question. So on my actual team, so the people that were in that photograph, they are in computer science, engineering, and there's one person who's in philosophy. They tend to be very broadly trained. So a lot of them, so they're all graduate students, and a lot of them, when they did their undergrad, they often did multidisciplinary undergrad. So they would, do computer science as a major, and then philosophy as a minor, or psychology as a minor, or do engineering as a major and take lots of courses in neuroscience or biology. And so, I tend to look for students with that kind of varied background. They don't all have that. And when they come into my lab, they also get training, which is very broad. So, the lab as a whole, we work with neuroscientists and look at their neural data. We don't collect data ourselves, except on rare occasions. So, we are basically dependent on other people to test the models that we have and to give us insight into some details of the neural function that we see. And so a lot of these students get opportunities to collaborate with people around the world. So this summer I had a student at Stanford that was working with somebody who does neuroimaging to help them model what they were doing, but also to understand exactly how do we get that data out of real brains so we can make sure when we build a model, we get the data out in the same kind of way. I had another student go to Yale and do work at a rodent lab where they're recording individual neurons. And so ideally, the students get a fairly broad exposure. So the team itself, that you saw as engineers and computer scientists, but definitely we work with, and a philosopher, but definitely we work with neuroscientists, psychologists, biologists, and computer scientists and engineers as well, in other departments which are interested in these same kinds of questions, because it's definitely a super interdisciplinary field.
It definitely seems that way. And the last question I think I'm able to squeeze in today is about your path here, and maybe any advice you might have for students who think this is interesting or are really interested in the idea of bringing different disciplines together for interdisciplinary research. So how you got here, and what students might be able to do if they're interested in following in your footsteps or something similar.
Right, yeah, that's a good question. It definitely wasn't a planned path. So, I wasn't the age of these students and then decided to myself, I'm going to do theoretical neuroscience. Is quite different. I had no idea, probably like most people here will have no idea when they're finished high school what they really want to do. But I seemed to be doing pretty well in math and science, so I went into engineering. I did an undergraduate degree in engineering and in systems design engineering here at Waterloo, in fact. And while I was doing that, I got much more interested in psychology and philosophy than I had been before, because you don't really have access to those courses in high school typically. So when I ran into those courses, I really liked them a lot, and I actually started taking many philosophy and psychology courses on top of my engineering degree, and thought at one point about switching into psychology, in fact, because I really thought this was more interesting than engineering. And the one thing I would say is that would have been the worst mistake of my life. So I'm very glad that I stuck with engineering and finished up my engineering degree, because I otherwise would not have been able to pursue the kind of work that I'm doing now. And so, I did at the same time realize that I wasn't cut out to be an engineer. It didn't really interest me that much. And I really was interested in how the brain worked. And so what I did is, once I finished my engineering degree, I went and got a master's in philosophy, working with somebody doing cognitive science, so really focused on how the mind works. And then I found a program called Philosophy, Neuroscience, and Psychology in the United States and did my PhD down there. Again, really focused on the area that I was interested in. While I was doing my PhD, I ran into a physicist who was building all these kinds of models. And because I had an engineering degree, I could work with him and, sort of expand the theory and really begin to work in the field that I'm in now. So essentially what happened is I didn't know what I wanted to do, went into a technical field, figured out what I wanted to do, finished my technical degree, and then just did whatever seemed most interesting to answer the questions that started to, interest me, which was like, how does the mind work? What's going on inside our heads? And I think, that path to interdisciplinarity is probably a common one, where you're not pursuing a discipline, you're pursuing a question, right? You're pursuing an area of interest and research. And then and I think, that's a reasonable way to try to figure out what it is that you'll find rewarding to do with your career in the future. And then the one piece of advice that I think I would learn and would pass on to people is that if you have technical aptitude, or you're interested in math and science, that's probably a really useful background in many fields that you go into. So right now, when I look around and I see people doing linguistics, or even in the languages, in English departments and so on, many of them are using computers to do analysis of text or what have you. If you want to do AI kinds of stuff, obviously you need technical backgrounds. If you want to build robots or look at, how brains work in detail, right now there's a lot of sort of math and computer models are playing a really, really big role in trying to understand the brain, because it's so complicated. We can't write down our theories in any other way. And so having those kind of technical skills opens up a whole host of ways of thinking about complicated and difficult problems that are otherwise sort of closed to you. So I think that hopefully answers your question. Basically,
yes, I think so. Okay. I was just going to comment that you are by no means the first researcher or guest we've had on this webinar series who has indicated that you kind of can't go wrong with at least a basic knowledge in computer science, as informatics and different programming skills just seem to be infiltrating almost all of the disciplines now.
Yeah, and engineering is actually a similar way. You get a very similar set of skills in engineering, a little bit more sort of applied to building things, as it were. But yeah.
Well, thank you so much. That's all the time we have. But thank you, Dr. Eliasmith, for introducing us to this field of theoretical neuroscience and all the interdisciplinary arms of that, and answering our questions today.
My pleasure.
So join us again for more PIR live events, including our webinars next week on the history of quack medicine and sustainable forestry. More information and a full schedule are both available at pirweb.org. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a great day.